What would have happened if Mags had never volunteered for Annie in the Quarter Quell? This has been one of the most heavily requested questions for me to answer, and for a few reasons I have been a little hesitant to answer it. The main one being is that I think it's an incredibly dark question and will lead to a very dark answer, but more so because we don't actually know that much about Annie's character, especially how much her mental instability actually affects her. Katniss essentially describes Annie as the victor who went a little crazy after her Hunger Games, and we further learn that during her Hunger Games, Annie witnessed her district partner be beheaded, and this traumatized her so greatly that she started to spiral. We meet Annie properly in Mockingjay after the tributes are rescued from the Capitol, and Katniss sees her as quite nice, very gentle, very kind. She even takes Annie to District 12 to use one of her old Victory Tour wedding dresses so that she can get married to Finnick in a proper wedding dress. We also know that Annie was staunchly against the Hunger Games, and very likely with the rebel movement, but not that involved with the actual semantics of it. Because in Mockingjay, Finnick explains that they captured Annie not to gather information out of her because she didn't know anything, but to use her against him. But at the end, Annie firmly votes no against the new Hunger Games being created. She is very firmly in her stance that Finnick also would think the same thing. But other than that, this is really all that we know about Annie. We don't know exactly what triggers her. We don't know exactly how incapacitated she is when she is triggered. We know that when she is triggered, she tends to put her hands over her ears and her head down, and that she's kind of in that position until she's calmed down again. We don't know how this will reflect in the games, and we don't exactly know how much of a liability she really will be. But we can pretty well safely assume that just the idea of going back into the Hunger Games is so horrifying and so triggering for Annie that she is almost inconsolable and hysterical at the reaping. And this is what spurs Mags to initially volunteer for her. But what if Mags didn't? How would that change the dynamics of the arena? I think the greatest change that this would have would be with Finnick and his role in the rebel plot. Because though Finnick was seemingly inconsolable and Mags did die in the arena, I do think he knew deep down that this was the way it was always going to end. But Mags was his mentor, Mags was the one who raised him, and so he had a deep love for her. But Mags was also the person who had been protecting him. And that is a shift in dynamic compared to what it would be like if Annie was going into the arena. Mags was Finnick's mentor. Finnick was Annie's mentor. And so during training, Finnick was able to focus on the rebel plot because his role was the protector of Katniss and Peeta. He was able to dissociate himself a little bit from his district partner because he knew deep down that the most important thing was getting Katniss and Peeta out alive. But if Annie were there, that would no longer be the case. I do believe that Finnick would want to get involved with the rebel movement. I do believe he would want to help them as much as he could. But I do think that the leaders of the rebel movement would also be aware that Finnick's only priority, Finnick's main priority going into that arena would be to save Annie. And the most crucial thing the rebel victors had when going into the arena, the thing that they all had to agree on before they went in there, was that they were willing to die if it meant that Katniss and Peeta got out. And I do not believe that if Finnick went in there with Annie, that he would have that same conviction. Even if Annie knew about the rebel movement, even if Annie herself wanted to get involved and to help, I still believe that Finnick would see himself as a protector and still want to save her. But there is also then the option that Finnick and Annie both were aware of the rebel movement and both agreed to go in knowing they would die to help the cause. And I do think this would be harder for Finnick to rationalize, but I do think it is the only scenario where he might be as involved in the rebel movement as he was before. And that is if Annie is just as aware of what is going on as he is. Which then begs the question, could Annie ever truly be exactly aware of everything that is going on? Why hadn't Finnick told her about the rebel plans? Why didn't she know anything when she was captured by the Capitol? It could be that Finnick only found out about the true rebel plans when he was actually reaped for the Quarter Quell and when he went to the Capitol. It could be that he was trying to protect Annie and he knew that this was always a risk. It could be that he just believed that she couldn't handle the information or the level of worry she would have for him in that arena, on top of the worries she already had. And there are a lot of variables we don't know, so there's going to be a lot of assumptions. But let's say that both Finnick and Annie went into the arena, both aware of the rebel plan, both willing to give their lives for the cause to save Katniss and Peeta. I think at this stage, the main question we have is whether or not Annie can actually handle being back in the arena. We know that Annie's arena was flooded in order to help her get out of it, and she was the one who survived because she was the one who knew best how to swim. But what we don't know is whether water and swimming still triggers her. And the Quarter Quell was very much a water-based arena, and the only two people in the grouping of 4 that happened at the beginning of the Quarter Quell, which was Finnick, Katniss, Peeta, and Annie, who could actually swim, were Katniss and Finnick. And Finnick essentially had to go save Peeta and drag him out of the water, and so it could be that Katniss actually went and saved Annie and got her out. And Katniss took a liking to Annie pretty immediately after meeting her, the same way she did with Mags, so we can assume that Katniss and Annie would have that same comfort level, and that even if Katniss didn't trust Finnick, she would still trust Annie. So let's say that Annie survives the initial bloodbath, and they all go off into the jungle, and they all go off and search for safety. There is still a very high likelihood that Annie could die at any given moment if immediately triggered and unable to get out of it. Mags Mags dies after she sacrifices herself to the fog and Finnick is unable to carry her anymore. And a lot of people might be saying, but Finnick could just carry Annie everywhere. That might just be the same thing as Mags. But the problem is that Mags was a willing participant. She allowed herself to be carried and she made it as easy for Finnick as possible. Whereas Annie, someone in an incredibly triggered state, is not going to be as easy to move. And so she could have perished in the fog if triggered. But let's say that this didn't trigger her because it wasn't something she had come across in her own games and that they moved on to the next sector. They were then facing the Mutts, and Mutts are something that are in most of the Hunger Games, and thus Annie would have come across Mutts in some degree. More than anything, she would have come across the bloodshed and the fighting that came with fighting the Mutts. And so I think if anything were to fully trigger her and send her into a catatonic state, it would be the Mutts. And one of the only reasons that Katniss, Peeta, and Finnick were able to make it out of the Mutts alive was because the Morphling sacrificed herself for Peeta. They were very nearly killed by these creatures because they were trying to get each other out. And if they had someone like Annie there who wasn't able to fight and who wasn't able to help and who was just a bit of a liability, that would inhibit them greatly. Because I don't believe they would have left her. I don't believe they would have let her perish there. They would have tried to drag her out and they would have tried to drag her to safety, and that could have really hurt them. And so I think it's incredibly likely that Annie or even another person might have died here. Because there is no way that Finnick is leaving Annie. And even with Mags, none of them wanted to leave her. The only reason that Mags died was because she sacrificed herself. And I think this is exactly the type of thing that the rebels would have wanted to have avoided. They can't afford to have Finnick prioritize anyone over Katniss and Peeta. And so it really was the ideal situation that Mags went in instead of Annie. And so while I do believe that someone, if not Annie, would have died here, let's say that she makes it to the end. They make it to the tree. Katniss and Peeta were purposefully split up here. I do not believe that Finnick would have left Annie alone for a second. And when they all eventually split up and all hell breaks loose, I believe that Finnick would have either taken Annie with him or would have left her with Beetee by the tree. So either way, I do think that Annie would have ended up in District 13 and not with the capital, which would have helped Finnick's mental stability, but would have also left Katniss quite alone in District 13 because she really relied on Finnick and the similar situation they were in. But either way, I do think it was for the best and within the rebels' interest to have Mags go in instead of Annie. What do you guys think would have happened?